Hi, I'm Bob,
And I'm Sherry.
and this is Mostly Politics with Bob and Sherry.
And today we're interviewing the Republican candidate for U.S. Congress District 17, Mr. Jason Killmeyer. Good morning and welcome, Jason.
Morning. Thanks for having me.
So, Jason, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, your background?
Absolutely. And again, Bob and Sherry, I'm happy to be here. I was born a couple miles away from where I am right now in Bellevue. And I was raised in Mount Lebanon Township, graduate of Mount Lebanon School. I went to St. Bernard's for 8 years, Catholic school, and then graduated from Mount Lebanon. Ended up in Washington, D.C. I spent a dozen years there working primarily in national security, both counterterrorism and federal supply chain. Final role there, I was chief of staff of global defense for a company called Deloitte Consulting. And then I jumped into conservative politics in a very deep way, in a very committed way, as the chief operating officer of an organization called Project Veritas with James O'Keefe.
Can you tell us a little bit about your experience at Project Veritas?
Absolutely. So I knew we were going to be on the front lines. And when I talked to James before I joined, one of the things he said to me was something to the effect of, and this is probably more of a paraphrase than an exact quote, was, if you join us, there's no going back to polite society. And my response in some paraphrase again was, polite society has much less to recommend itself than it used to. And so I knew we'd be on the front lines. The very first day I was there, I was literally signing my offer letter. And we had a Google engineer who provided us leaked documents from Google about some of the diversity and equity concerns that they were literally working into algorithms via machine learning. So I knew right then we were going to be at the forefront. We went after the New York Times. We went after CNN. We proved voter fraud. We went after big tech hard, Facebook, Google, and more. So it was an adventure every day, but I wouldn't trade it for a second.
And why did you leave Project Veritas?
You know, Sherry, I missed my hometown. And I think I always knew I was coming back to Pittsburgh at some point in Western Pennsylvania. My folks are still in the same red brick house that they were in Mount Lebanon that I grew up in, that they bought back in the early 80s. My aunts and uncles are still in, for the most part, their same houses. I missed that, having my whole family, my sisters back here, and just wanted to be part of that again. But I looked at Western Pennsylvania with the energy reserves that we have, the intellectual capital that we have, the mature philanthropic scene that we have. And I remember thinking, we got to have leadership changes back here. And so I know a lot of conservatives, right, who are part of these different national organizations. They moved to Florida, or they moved to Texas, or they're down in Nashville now, somewhere in Tennessee. And my thinking is, no, go to your home states, stand and fight. And that's what I'm here to do.
Okay.
So, have you always been conservative?
As far as I can remember, I remember two kind of formative experiences for me, Bob. One was I was delivering pizza for Pizza Outlet. And I ended up going out to, I grew up in Mount Lebanon, but I went up to the one in Peters Township because I figured they would tip even a little bit better out there. And so I had a little brown Honda, and I was delivering pizza, and I would listen to talk radio. And I went from the sports station one time over to, I think it was Rush, or it might have been Glenn Beck at the time. And I just started tuning in more and more. But the first book that I read politically that I remember was called Bias by a guy named Bernard Goldberg. He was a CBS producer, and he documented pretty methodically the just obvious bias under Dan Rather at CBS News. And obviously, he was proven right over time with how Dan Rather's career sort of unraveled there. Once I saw that, once I saw behind the curtain, I couldn't unsee it. And I remember, I can trace the line from reading that book to eventually joining Project Veritas, where I saw further behind the curtain how the media manufactures stories, how they are quite literally a part of the left wing of our politics. And once I saw that again, I couldn't unsee it. Let me make another point here, early formative experience. I was at Penn State, and I remember orientation And I was told, they point out very casually, oh, that's where the free speech zone is. I'm thinking, what? So I think the very first or maybe second op-ed I ever wrote was to the Penn State Daily Collegian, where I just said, right, the idea of a free speech zone in this country is not something that we should be tolerating. And this really, to me, was this foreboding, this beginning of the absurdity that we've now seen blossom across college campuses to the detriment of our youth and our country.
What it's like to be a conservative and working with the federal government for 12 years? What it's like to be in that environment in D.C.?
Yeah, so D.C., right, went 94% for one candidate. So people tend to think of D.C. as, oh, it's fractious. No, D.C. is a political monoculture. And what I think is, I saw it change. When I got to D.C., and I was working in counterterrorism, and I mean very specifically, my job was to help keep terrorists from getting on planes and coming to the United States, and trying to protect any threats to civil aviation. That was an earlier era. And as time passed, I saw two things happen. The first of those was I saw DC building brand new condos in every direction and McMansions for 30 miles in every direction. And there used to be a humility associated with that. And that was gone. They sell more Lamborghinis and Teslas in the Washington metro area, I think, than they do in almost anywhere else in the country. So I saw this thing happening where both the government was spending out of control while the rest of the country was suffering from a recession and relative economic expectations that never recovered. And I believe that impacts so much of our politics even now, is that financial crisis. But then I saw this very self-assured, self-righteous brand of bureaucrat come into power. And then all of a sudden the people said, we don't like this. And we're going to send this guy to Washington in 2016. And we're going to send you a message. And did that cause any amount of self-reflection amongst this bureaucratic class? No. We saw the FBI engage in steps that would make J. Edgar Hoover blush. And so it was very interesting for me to see that evolution over time. So when I went to join Veritas, it was because I said, I can't just yell at the news anymore. I'm seeing what's happening in this town, and I've got to go jump into this fight in some other way.
So is this why you're motivated to run for political office?
Yeah, and the reason I want to get involved is twofold, Sherry. The first is exactly that. It's ours. We own this government. We have allowed this to happen. We self-govern. If we are upset by the things we're seeing in Washington, we can change them. We send 435 people from around the country, and they get into a big room and they work these committee processes. And what do they do from there? They come up with the ideas that eventually get passed from legislation. So I'll give you an example. We talk about something like term limits, or we talk about some of the ethical things that Congress people need to do. I'm personally taking a pledge that I will put every asset that I have into a blind trust so that I cannot profit from office when I'm there. Enough people do that, we all of a sudden see that change. So that's what I'm trying to kind of shake people from, is to say, what we see in Washington isn't permanent. We chose it and we can unchoose it. I know that we can do that. But also why I'm running now, right, is I look around at the state of the country, the political violence that we've seen, these disastrous lockdowns and shutdowns, the decline in civic trust that those accomplished, these terrible things that have happened. I mean, there was a mass assassination attempt against Republican congressmen only 4 or 5 years ago on a softball field in Northern Virginia. Those are not the signs of a healthy republic. And so the truest motivation for why I decided to run for Congress is we are riding those waves of instability at the exact same time that a motivated left wing is embracing essentially an alien form of government and social democracy. And there is no guarantee that our side wins. We have to fight that battle and we have to win it, or they will quite literally change the terms of the union. We used to always say, hey, the left wants to change the country and they want it to be something different. They're now telling us exactly what they want it to be, and they're making moves to put that in place. We have to win.
Realizing in Congress you're just one representative, but if you could author any piece of legislation or advance any pieces of legislation on your first days, what would you do?
There are three, and let me say this in a very active voice, Bob. I am going to write these pieces of legislation. One of them I intend to complete before I'm elected, and that's something called the Fourth Amendment Restoration Act. We need to reset the balance of power. We talked about the abuses of the FBI a few minutes ago. I just heard that there are potentially new revelations about a CIA domestic surveillance program. None of us feel good when we go through the TSA line at the airport. I can no longer accept these types of abridgments from my federal government, and the American people can no longer accept them either. So we can change these things. We can reform how these federal agencies are operating by reaffirming the primacy of the Fourth Amendment. And I think that will reset the balance between citizen and state. But more immediately to people's concerns, I'm going to write a number of laws
Could you just state the Fourth Amendment real quick?
Absolutely. That is our right to be free from unreasonable search and seizure. And so in my opinion, right, I talk to young people, and there's a meme that they share. And that meme is a joke about, I wonder what my FBI agent thinks about what I'm Googling today. And they mean it half in jest, but even that thought amongst the American people, I want to banish that. I don't want to live in that country where people think that, one, the government is omnipotent, or two, it's spying on them. That chills speech, it limits civil society, it harms civic trust. So I think if we could, when I write that legislation and we pass it, and I think I can do so on a bipartisan basis, by the way, I think that will help restore a balance. Quite frankly, the federal government needs to back off. And I think we all feel that.
Would that essentially be a piece of, because the Fourth Amendment's already there, so would that sort of be a piece of legislation to challenge the Patriot Act or some elements?
Good question. So I'm modeling it after something called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of the early 1990s. And the idea was for the legislature to essentially fire a shot across the bow that says to the courts and to the executive branch that they do not have the latitude they think they do in interpreting our constitutional clauses. We are the first branch, the legislature, right? And the House of Representatives is the closest to the people. So what I want to write a law called the Fourth Amendment Restoration Act specifically to reaffirm the primacy across the federal government. So any agency that is doing those types of things is now not just violating a constitutional oath that many have ignored. They are explicitly violating a recently passed law that can be enforced by the courts, and we can hold them accountable via the oversight mechanisms that the legislature has. So that sounds kind of wonky to people when I talk about it, right? Outside of audiences like you two and some of your listeners, but I feel like it's a very important thing. And then what I'm going to do at that point is there are about 4 or 5 industries where we can bring jobs back to the United States. And I think that we can pass relatively clean bills that even Joe Biden, a humble Joe Biden, might sign. So right now there's a law in Congress working its way through about bringing semiconductor manufacturing back to the United States. Senator Tom Cotton has introduced another bill to bring rare earth elements, to reestablish a foundry, a domestic foundry for rare earth elements, semiconductors, sensitive medical supplies, shipbuilding, obviously energy here in Western Pennsylvania. I want to pass laws, and I think I can in my first term, to bring these types of industries back. We just went through a pandemic in which we were dependent for pharmaceutical precursors on the very country that caused the pandemic in the first place, that also happens to be our number one adversary. We can never let ourselves be in that position again.
So I have a question for you. You have worked in the arena of counterterrorism. Mm-hmm. And one of the and Patriot Act was incorporated after 9/11. What if people would say, Well, the reason the FBI or CIA is looking into and have the surveillance system in place is to protect the American citizen from terror attack. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I think they'd probably be correct. And my answer is the risk um, um, of canceling those programs is lesser than the risk of maintaining them. They were put in place, to your point, with good intentions at the time. Um, but now is the time to change them. The American citizen feels too disempowered. They're too distrustful of their government. And that risk to me is greater than that risk. And really, let me dive in here. I believe that there is still going to be a risk of terrorist attack from Afghanistan. The Biden administration does not have a plan. And all of the things that they promised as it related to an over-the-horizon capability, none of that is materializing. But what I tell people is this: the federal government is a very blunt instrument, and we must be very humble in how we wield it. The reason that we take our shoes off at the airport is because a British Muslim man tried to stick explosives in his shoes and kill a bunch of Americans. And then the reason that we can carry only containers below a certain threshold is because a group of Pakistan-trained terrorists tried to use essentially Gatorade containers with powder explosives to blow up airplanes. So the government enacted these laws, I think, in generally in good faith. But it is time to sunset them, because at this point, the damage to the civic trust outweighs the risk that they prevent. And so I think we either need to sunset or repeal the Patriot Act, and or at least very major provisions of it.
So my question is also, you understand running a political campaign is pretty expensive. And to a lot of your party activists, you're somewhat new to the political arena here in Pennsylvania. How do you plan on winning the primary, and how do you planning on getting your messaging out? What is your winning strategy?
Yeah, thank you for asking me that. And one of the things I'll say, Sherry and Bob, meeting you guys, going to the events that I've gone to over the past 14, 15 months, it's been such a welcoming experience. And it might not have gone that way. People have been open about talking to me, have invited me to things. I showed up at an event, I think it was at Sunny Jim's maybe a year ago, and I got invited at that event to 3 more events. And so I wasn't even on the mailing list at first. It was just people who would shoot me texts to come to events until I eventually signed up for some of them. So I've gotten to know people, and that's been just a humbling experience. But let me kind of address the point you make. If it was simply a fundraising match, then we wouldn't need to hold the votes. It would just be whoever could raise the most money. And I think that the establishment candidates across the country this cycle are in for an awakening. I believe that the work of the party, the Republican Party, is to continue to transition itself to a workers' party and a working class party. And so I think the strategies that have carried candidates previously won't. But let me very tactically also say, because people deserve to hear some of this, I have built a full campaign. I've had a full-time campaign manager in place for months, a national level consulting firm helping guide me on certain elements of strategy, a national level digital team, as well as local support in each of those areas. I have a grassroots coordinator. So we've been running a full size and full maturity campaign. There have been certain elements of visibility that we have deliberately kept low so that we have a focused spend here in the remaining foot race. And that's our strategy, is to win a foot race here at the end. When I've gotten to talk to people in candidate forums, in small groups, at committees, sometimes it's just meeting folks at Eaton Park or at a diner, 2 or 3 committee members after I've addressed a local committee. They'll text me and say, hey, let's get together, and I'll meet them for a cup of coffee. I'm hearing what folks' concerns are. I'm at probably 3 to 4 events a day, sometimes 5. And so I'm just meeting as many people as I can here in Allegheny County and out in the Beaver.
Let's say if you win the primary and you will be in the general and to challenge possibly Connor Lamb, which is a huge, talk about establishment and the money machine. How do you plan on winning the general?
Good question. It's the exact same message that I've had right now. We got to bring jobs back here. We got to secure our border, and we got to stop spending like crazy. I truly believe that's going to appeal to a very, very wide swath of voters this cycle. And we see that in the crossover of people from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. I hear it from parents, many of whom are not politically involved. And they just said, I didn't like politics. I didn't watch cable news. But now I've got to leave my job early and go down to my school because they're teaching my kid what? So that's the movement. And I hear from folks, right, hey, how is your message going to appeal? You are a Project Veritas guy. You're sort of more associated with the far right. How are you going to appeal to voters? And my message to them is it's one consistent voice all the way through. But tactically also, from an election perspective, I think it'll be Chris Deluzio or Sean Malloy, probably Chris Deluzio, who will be the Democratic candidate. And quite frankly, I believe that candidate holds views that are disqualifying, to include his support of House Resolution 1, which is an attempted federal takeover of our election system. I don't believe the American people are in that mood. They've seen Washington overstep, and I think that appetite is quickly diminishing.
Can you explain to the audience what the House Resolution 1 is?
Absolutely. So, and notice, everybody, that the title of that is House Resolution 1. This has been the Democrats' first priority for 3 Congresses in a row. What the Democrats want to do is to take over our election systems, to make all the changes that they ushered through in a rush in 2020 permanent and federally mandated. This usurps the constitutional authority given to states to maintain their own elections. This would be a sea change in American democracy. That's why it has been their first priority, resolution number 1 in 3 Congresses in a row. People need to understand that if Democrats pass that, it is a defining / breaking point in American history, and it's something that we cannot permit to occur.
On energy, we were told under Trump, towards the end of Trump, that we were energy independent. We were a net exporter of energy. And then prices started to go up, gas prices with inflation. And the White House said that it was due to greedy oil companies, that we gave them 7,000 leases to explore land. They don't need any more. They're just being greedy and keeping the price up. And then it became Putin. So because of the war in Ukraine disrupted global energy supplies, and so now it's Putin's fault. I mean, were we energy independent? I mean, and are we no longer net exporters? I mean, what's your take on all that, and what's the solution?
Yeah, Joe Biden is lying. That's the number one takeaway for the American people. Joe Biden's lying. They are using numbers about the approval of permits for oil and gas on federal lands and the pace at which they've distributed those. And yet, what they're failing to tell people is that they're attempting at the very same time to enact a massive historic raise on fees for those very permits, which will slow down production, and that half of those permits, if you started a project, it would get delayed in environmental review and maybe never get completed. So Joe Biden is trying to have his cake and eat it too. We were, if not fully energy independent, at least that net exporter or very close to it. Prices on energy started to go up, not just with inflation, but when Joe Biden came into office. And the reason was because they were already floating that Interior Department ban on new leases for oil and gas. What did that signal to the market to do? To raise prices with the presumption that supply would be diminishing in the future. So that damage has been done. And then the Biden administration did approve some more leases and then turned around and enacted essentially a quasi-ban with the threat of this rate hike. That apparently has now been undone by a federal judge. So where they are is trying to have their cake and eat it too and point to these other examples. But more importantly about energy, right? Where we are sitting right now, this should be an energy capital of the world. We should be having a boom moment right now in Western Pennsylvania. And there is a committed cadre of anti-pipeline, anti-carbon activists. Everybody talks about the Keystone Pipeline. They forget about Penn East or M5 or M3, which are currently being threatened by those same radical activists with that exact same plan. You bring up environmental concerns, you involve Native American groups. It is literally a playbook that they have. I mean that in the most literal way, a playbook that they have to try to kill pipeline access. If we look at Ukraine and Russia, what underlies the timing of the invasion? It was the continued isolation of Ukraine via Russia as it built pipeline capacity around Ukraine, right? How and where energy flows is a significant element or underpinning of global security dynamics. It explains so much. Energy independence is national security for the United States. And let me make one final point here as it relates to the pipeline and these things. I don't want to live in a country like, for example, in Clairton. There are concerns about the environmental quality of the air there and cancer rates. We don't want to live in a country in which people are getting sick because of those environmental concerns. But what the environmentalists would have us do is simply kill the growth. And then what happens? We've seen this in Pittsburgh when industry goes away. In Western Pennsylvania, people leave. So if people are leaving, if we don't have those jobs, if those projects are just getting killed instead of being built with carbon capture technology or in other more advanced ways, then we know it's the wrong calculation. We're not protecting the space if no one lives here anymore. And that's the trade-off we're getting wrong and that I intend to fight against.
I have another question on national security, and I didn't even know this until a personal friend of mine experienced this. Her uncle owns a medium-sized hotel chain, and one day, customer walk in, the entire computer system was shut down, and turned out it was Russian hackers. And I didn't even know company are buying these terrorism insurance, and they wound up paying the hacker $5 million from the insurance company. That was the first time I ever heard of it. With the capability of United States and how much money we spend on national security, should this type of incident be not so frequent? Because after talking to them, and turn out this happens quite often a lot. We keep paying these people millions of dollars and thinking they're not going to keep hacking. How's that work?
Yeah, the Biden administration thinks that ransomware is a cost that the American businesses should tolerate. And I have called them out on that, and I'll ask people to look at some of the past writing I've done on this. The Biden administration is essentially saying, this is just a cost of doing business. And my answer to American businesses is, unfortunately, that's all your federal government under the Democrats is willing to do for you right now, is tell you, invest in better cybersecurity, and we're going to do some information sharing. What we need to be doing is deterring these actors. They've shut down in the past 13, 14 months, the major East Coast pipeline in the United States of America. Think about that. If you would have put that in a TV show 10 years ago, no one would have believed you in a script. It would have seemed too fantastical. That moment happened. They came after our food supply. A ransomware attack shut down meat processing plants here in the United States from Russia-based actors. And what has been the U.S. response to that? A couple of financial sanctions. Interpol put out some arrest warrants for people. I think Putin might have nabbed a couple of guys that are probably now working for him in the government specifically. So what we've done, right? We were talking earlier, Bob and Sherry, about sort of we are in some ways leaving that era of the counterterrorism era that defined our national security outlook for a long time, and we're in a new era. The starting gun has gone off, and the U.S. is behind. This type of conflict, ransomware, other attacks coming after American businesses. China hacked the Microsoft Office server. Right? If you think about how people use Outlook and the calendar function, they hacked a vulnerability in that and went after thousands of American businesses universities, nonprofits, educational institutions, and hoovered up all of their calendar and contact information. This was a year ago, and no one talks about it now. So what I say is we need a new cyber doctrine in this country. It needs to involve public responses, some which will be in the virtual sphere and others which will be in the very real world. And we need to create that deterrence. This is not an acceptable cost of doing business. You are exactly right.
Could you tell us if you have any sort of moral, philosophical beliefs that sort of form your story, the Jason Killmeyer story?
Yeah, and let me say kind of the core of my overall belief system is I'm Roman Catholic, and that forms a lot of my outlook. But where I look at what I'll say is the philosophical blueprint, what kind of motivates me when I wake up in the morning, or what do I think about, is a quote. And that quote is, persistence and determination alone are omnipotent. And I think it was a Roosevelt quote. And what I tell people is, I don't get it right every time. I'm going to be a warts and all candidate. I'm not as polished as some of the other folks who get involved in politics. What I am good at doing, and the reason I've had some of the career success that I've had, is I just keep trying. And I'm going to outwork people. And I get up at 4:45 in the morning, and I go. And so that is kind of the underpinning. I'm a believer that if we keep trying really hard, if we are persistent, I believe persistence is king, we can all arrive at the right answers. Why does that translate into what I'm doing here? Because we self-govern. No one's coming to save us. The corruption in Washington, we're either going to continue to tolerate it or we won't. And so that's what I try to tell people is the buck has now passed. We are responsible. It has passed to us. This is our generational responsibility. What I tell people is the Bill of Rights is in some ways a bill of lading. It comes with it responsibility. And we have to exercise that responsibility. We need to protect the First Amendment against those who would use words like hate speech or other types of restrictions and censorship to quiet people. We have to protect the Second Amendment for very obvious reasons. Our job is to protect this form of government and pass it along. From a philosophical perspective, again, we're all fallible. My Catholicism teaches me that, but again, that's where you come back to persistence. If we keep trying, we all get in the room free of ego, we'll eventually arrive at the right answer.
So, we're coming to a kind of closing here. In the event you do not win the primary, will you stand behind the candidate that win the primary in your party?
I will, because we cannot lose this seat. I believe I'm the best positioned candidate to win. I think we have a well-defined, if narrow, lane, but we're very comfortable with our prospects in the next couple of weeks and very comfortable with both the cash on hand and the spend plan that we have. But if I don't win and the voters go in another direction, the people who are running for office on the Democratic side, they're not pretending to be moderates this time around. We have to win this seat. So yes, I'll support the winner that the voters choose on May 17th. I hope it's me.
Okay, well, thank you so much for coming on, and hopefully we can chat again sometimes in the future.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this, Bob, Sherry. Thanks for having me.
Okay,
Thanks,
thank you.
Jason.